My family excluded me from the inheritance. A decade later I took control of it. My name is Margaret, and I'm sitting in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching the rain streak down the windows as I've done countless times over the past decade. But today feels different. Today I'm finally ready to tell you how I lost everything I thought was mine. I grew up in a grand Victorian house in Seattle, the kind of place where every room held a memory, every corner whispered stories of generations before me. My father, James Mitchell, was a successful pharmaceutical executive. My mother, Catherine, came from old money, the kind that doesn't need to be talked about because it's simply understood. I had an older brother, David, and we grew up with the understanding that our family's wealth would sustain us, guide us, and ultimately define our futures. My childhood wasn't particularly happy though. Money filled the house but not the spaces between us. Father worked relentlessly. Mother spent her days organizing charity events and maintaining appearances. David was always the golden child. 5 years older, already successful in his own right, married with 2 children by the time I was in my 20s. And then there was me, struggling to find my place in a family that seemed to have predetermined paths for everyone but couldn't quite figure out what to do with me. I was the dreamer. The one who wanted to be a writer, who took acting classes, who spent summers volunteering at homeless shelters instead of interning at prestigious law firms. My parents tolerated these pursuits the way you might tolerate a child's temporary fascination with finger painting. They smiled politely, wrote checks to cover the costs, and waited for me to grow out of it and become sensible. But I never did grow out of it. At 25, I was working as a freelance journalist, barely scraping by, living in a modest apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. I wasn't rich like my family. I wasn't prestigious. I wasn't what they'd hoped I would be. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something authentic, something real. The day everything changed started like any other. It was a Thursday in March, and I remember the cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom. My mother called me, a rare occurrence as our conversations had become increasingly strained over the years. Her voice sounded different. Tighter. More controlled than usual. "Margaret, your father is ill," she said without preamble. "It's his heart. The doctors say it could happen any time." I remember the coffee in my hand suddenly tasting like ash. My father, Invincible James Mitchell, wasn't supposed to be vulnerable. He wasn't supposed to be mortal. I told her I would come to the house that evening. What I didn't know was that my father had already made arrangements. He had already rewritten his will, spoken with lawyers, and made decisions that would echo through my life for the next 10 years. The funeral was held on a gray April morning, the kind of day where the sky seems to press down on you with its heaviness. I remember standing in the cemetery wearing a black dress that didn't feel like mine, watching my father's casket being lowered into the ground. My mother stood rigid beside me, her hand gripping my arm so tightly it left marks. David stood on her other side with his wife, Patricia, their 2 children kept at a distance, too young to understand what death meant. We returned to the house afterward. The living room had been transformed into something sterile and formal, filled with flowers that smelled too sweet and people who wore their condolences like uncomfortable suits. I moved through the crowd mechanically, accepting hugs from relatives I barely knew, listening to stories about my father that painted a picture of a man I'd never quite met. It was David who pulled me aside around dusk. He guided me into Father's study, a room I'd always been slightly afraid of, with its dark wood paneling and the leather chair that seemed to swallow anyone who sat in it. His expression was serious in a way that made my stomach clench. "The lawyer wants to read the will tomorrow," he said quietly. "Mr. Peterson. You remember him, right? He's been handling Father's affairs for years." I nodded, though I didn't remember any Mr. Peterson particularly well. My father kept his financial life completely separate from us, a sealed-off kingdom that we were never invited to explore. The next morning we gathered in the formal dining room. My mother sat at the head of the table, her face carefully composed. David sat to her right. I sat alone on the left side. Mr. Peterson, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he'd witnessed every possible human reaction to money, opened his leather briefcase and removed a thick stack of papers. I won't describe the details of the will in clinical terms. What I will tell you is that my father's estate was valued at approximately $47 million. This included the house, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and various other assets accumulated over a lifetime of financial success. My mother received the house and a trust worth $18 million, designed to provide her with income for life and ensure her comfort in her remaining years. David received $15 million outright, along with controlling interest in several investment properties. There were smaller bequests to various charities that my parents supported, to household staff who had served for decades, to my cousins and aunts. And for me, there was a single paragraph. It stated that I was to receive $500,000, to be held in trust and distributed only when I reached the age of 35, with the condition that I demonstrate financial responsibility and stability in my life choices. The trustee, David, would have discretion over whether I met these conditions. I read those words 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding them. $500,000 sounds like an enormous sum to most people. To someone who had grown up understanding that she would inherit tens of millions, it felt like an insult. It felt like a message written in money. You are not worth as much. You never were. Mr. Peterson must have seen something in my face, because he quickly added that my father had left a personal letter for me, sealed and marked to be given to me privately. I took the envelope with shaking hands. Later, alone in my childhood bedroom, I opened that letter. My father's handwriting was becoming shaky by then, and I could feel the struggle in each word. He wrote that he loved me but that he was concerned about my choices. He wrote that my mother needed security, that David had proven himself worthy of investment, that my path was uncertain and financially unsustainable. He wrote that the $500,000 was meant to encourage me toward stability, toward marriage, toward a real career, toward becoming someone who could manage wealth responsibly. What he actually wrote was, "You've disappointed me, and I'm not confident you'll ever change." I never showed that letter to anyone. I folded it carefully and placed it in a box under my bed, where it would remain for years, a paper reminder of exactly how my own father valued me. The weeks following the will reading were a blur of grief and something darker, something that felt a lot like rage, though I didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. My relationship with my mother deteriorated rapidly. She seemed almost relieved by the will's terms, as though they confirmed something she'd always suspected about me. David, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but he didn't fight it. He simply accepted the role my father had given him. I moved back to my apartment in Seattle, but everything felt different now. My work felt hollow. My friendships felt strained. I was 27 years old, and I felt like I'd been erased from my own family story. The next 10 years were not a straight path. They were a winding road full of detours, dead ends, and unexpected turns. But looking back now, I understand that those years weren't wasted time. They were the years when I actually became myself. The first year after the exclusion was the hardest. I fell into a depression that I didn't recognize as depression at first. I thought I was just being realistic, just adjusting my expectations. I told myself that plenty of people didn't inherit millions of dollars and they survived just fine. But the knowledge that I could have had that security, that my own father had actively chosen not to give it to me, created a wound that wouldn't close. I threw myself into work with a ferocity that surprised even me. My journalism took on a sharper edge. I started writing about wealth inequality, about family dysfunction, about the ways that money could poison relationships. Editors began to notice my work. I won a few small awards. The byline that appeared in regional publications and online magazines became slightly more prominent. But success in journalism, I learned quickly, doesn't translate to financial security. I was making enough to pay my rent and eat regularly, but I wasn't building wealth. I wasn't investing. I wasn't the kind of stable, responsible person my father had envisioned. Every time I thought about that $500,000 sitting in trust, inaccessible until I proved myself worthy, it felt like a punishment designed specifically to remind me of my inadequacy. At 29, I met someone. His name was Marcus, and he was a documentary filmmaker. We connected over coffee at the same cafe where I now sit years later. He was intelligent, creative, and completely unconcerned with the markers of success that had always mattered in my family. We dated for 3 years, and for a while I allowed myself to imagine a different future. Marcus wanted to travel, to make films about overlooked communities, to live authentically rather than opulently. My mother made her disapproval clear when she met him. He wasn't from the right background. He didn't have the right career trajectory. He would never be wealthy enough to deserve a Mitchell. When Marcus and I talked about getting engaged, my mother called me in tears, begging me not to make what she termed another mistake. I broke up with Marcus on a rainy afternoon in Portland. I'd moved there for work, taking a position as a staff writer for a mid-sized publication. The relationship ended not with drama, but with a quiet acceptance that we wanted different things. He wanted to build a life based on shared values and passion. I wanted to prove something to people who weren't even in the room anymore. That breakup was a turning point, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I was 32 years old, alone, professionally successful but financially precarious, and I realized something crucial. I had spent a decade trying to prove my worth to people who had already made up their minds about me. My father was dead. My mother had made clear that nothing I did would ever be enough. David had his life and I had mine, but I'd been living mine in reaction to theirs rather than in service of my own vision. I started therapy around this time. Dr. Patricia Chin was a woman in her 60s with an office overlooking Portland's Washington Park. For the first few months, I talked mainly about my family, about my father's rejection, my mother's disappointment, the isolation I felt. But gradually our conversations shifted. She helped me see that I had internalized my father's judgment. I was the one now excluding myself, now deciding that I wasn't worthy of comfort or security or happiness. Your father made a choice based on his own limitations and fears, she told me during one session. That choice says nothing about your actual value, but you're still letting it define you. Around the same time, I began researching my family's finances more seriously. I'd avoided doing this for years, both because I didn't want to confront the reality of what I'd been excluded from and because I felt some lingering shame about caring so much about money. But I started pulling public records, court documents, old news articles about my father's business dealings. What I discovered was illuminating. My father's pharmaceutical company had faced several lawsuits during the 1990s and early 2000s for aggressive marketing practices and dubious clinical trial procedures. He'd settled out of court in most cases, but the settlements were substantial. Some of the money that had created my family's wealth had come from practices that caused genuine harm to people. My father had never publicly acknowledged these issues. He'd simply written checks and moved on. This discovery didn't bring me satisfaction. Instead, it brought clarity. My father's judgment about financial responsibility was coming from a man who had built his wealth through morally questionable means. His assessment of my character was based on his own distorted values. Suddenly, being excluded from that money felt less like a personal failure and more like a liberation. At 35, I received the $500,000. By then, I'd established myself as a freelance investigative journalist with a growing reputation. I'd published a book, a collection of essays about wealth, family, and identity that had received critical acclaim. I was making a modest but sustainable living doing work I believed in. The money arrived in my bank account like a ghost, sudden and unsettling. For weeks I did nothing with it. I didn't spend it. I didn't invest it. I simply let it sit there, a reminder of all the years I'd been told it was coming, all the conditions I'd had to meet to receive it. Then one morning I made a decision. I contacted a financial advisor and had a serious conversation about what that money could actually do for me. Not as a way to prove my father wrong, but as a way to build security for the life I'd actually chosen. I invested a portion of it. I set aside another portion for the house I'd always wanted. And I donated a significant amount to organizations working on pharmaceutical accountability and healthcare justice, causes that had become central to my writing. That money, which had once represented everything I'd lost, became a tool for building the life I actually wanted rather than the life my family had predetermined for me. I'm 42 years old now and I'm sitting in that same coffee shop in Portland where Marcus and I first met, where I've spent countless hours writing and thinking and becoming whoever it is I've decided to become. The rain is falling outside as it so often does in this city, and I'm thinking about what it means to take control of your own narrative. The real reclamation didn't happen when I turned 35 and received that money. It happened gradually in small moments spread across years. It happened when I stopped waiting for my family's approval and started building something on my own terms. It happened when I realized that the inheritance I'd been excluded from was far less valuable than the inheritance I was creating for myself through my choices, my work, and my integrity. My relationship with my family has evolved in ways I never expected. My mother is 78 now. She lives in the Seattle house, the one I grew up in, and she's become increasingly isolated as she's aged. She lost my father, then my grandmother, then several close friends. The world she built on social status and careful appearances has contracted around her. We speak on the phone once a month. The conversations are polite but distant. She still doesn't understand the choices I've made, but she's stopped actively condemning them. There's a kind of sad acceptance in her voice when we talk, as if she's finally realized that her disappointment won't change the trajectory of my life. David and I have reconnected in recent years. His marriage to Patricia ended in divorce about 5 years ago, and the experience humbled him in ways I don't think he expected. He watched his carefully constructed life fractured in ways that money couldn't fix. We had lunch together in Seattle last year and he told me something that surprised me. He said he'd always envied my courage, my willingness to pursue something uncertain rather than simply accepting the path that had been laid out for me. I did everything right, he told me, looking at his coffee cup rather than at me. I followed the plan. I made the money. And I ended up divorced with 2 kids who see me every other weekend and a life that feels hollow. You took the hard road, but at least you own it. I didn't tell him that I hadn't always owned it. For a decade, I'd been angry and resentful, living as if I were being punished for my father's judgment. But somewhere around year 8 or 9 of that journey, something shifted. I stopped being a victim of my exclusion and started being the author of my own story. This is where the real story of reclamation begins. Not with taking control of the money, but with taking control of the narrative. My father had written a story in which I was the disappointment, the dreamer who would never amount to anything, the child who needed financial punishment to become responsible. I spent the first decade after his death living inside that story, trying to prove him wrong by becoming someone different, someone more acceptable. But the truth I eventually discovered is that his story about me was irrelevant. The only story that mattered was the one I was writing with my own choices. After I turned 35 and received that inheritance, I made a deliberate choice about how to use it. Part of the reclamation process was deciding that money wouldn't define my success or my worth. I'd already built a career I was proud of. I'd already established myself as a writer and journalist. I'd already created a community of people who valued me for who I actually was, not what I could inherit. The $500,000 became a means to deepen and secure that life, not to transform it. I bought a modest house in Portland. Nothing grand, nothing that would impress my mother, but something that was genuinely mine. I created a scholarship fund at Portland State University for first-generation college students pursuing journalism. I invested in supporting other writers whose work I believed in. And I used a portion of it to fund the long-form investigative projects that couldn't be sustained through regular journalism wages. What I didn't do was become someone different. I didn't transform into the responsible, wealthy woman my father had imagined. Instead, I became more fully myself, more secure in my choices, more capable of pursuing meaningful work, but fundamentally unchanged in my values and priorities. The real reclamation, though, happened in the writing. 5 years ago, I published an essay called The Inheritance That Wasn't in a major magazine. In it, I told the story of my exclusion, my decade of struggle, and what I'd learned about family, money, and identity. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people wrote to me. People who had been excluded from family inheritance, people who had felt judged by their families, people who had spent years trying to prove their worth to people incapable of seeing it. I realized that by telling my story I was taking back the narrative. My father's judgment no longer lived only in my own mind, quietly poisoning my sense of self-worth. It was now part of a larger conversation about family dysfunction, generational wealth, and the ways that money intersects with love and acceptance. Shortly after that essay was published, I received a letter from a lawyer. There had been an error in my father's estate administration, discovered during a routine audit by the company handling the trust. A significant portion of the pharmaceutical settlements, money that should have been distributed according to the terms of the will, had been misallocated. The error amounted to approximately $2 million. My portion, based on my father's original will structure, was substantial. My mother and David were entitled to their portions as well. The discovery was shocking. After all these years, after I'd made peace with the exclusion, after I'd built a life independent of that inheritance, I was suddenly being offered a financial security I'd never expected to have. I could have been bitter about this. I could have focused on the fact that I'd been wronged, that I'd struggled unnecessarily, that my father's judgment had been partly based on a flawed understanding of my inheritance. But by that point, I'd already learned that my worth wasn't determined by what my family gave me or didn't give me. I negotiated with David and my mother about the distribution. My mother, now older and increasingly concerned about her legacy, agreed to use her portion to establish a family foundation focused on healthcare ethics and pharmaceutical accountability, directly addressing the moral issues that had haunted my father's career. David was relieved to have additional security, though he was also processing his own complicated feelings about our father's legacy. For myself, I decided to use the money in a way that felt aligned with everything I'd learned. I started a fellowship program for investigative journalists investigating corporate malfeasance. I created an endowment supporting mental health services for people struggling with family trauma. And I invested in the kind of long-term financial security that meant I no longer had to make compromises in my work to pay my bills. But here's what's important. That money didn't save me. My decade of struggle, my therapy, my work as a journalist, my willingness to build a life independent of my family's approval. That's what saved me. The money simply made possible what I'd already become. Now when I sit in this coffee shop and look back at the young woman I was at 27, angry and excluded and convinced that her life was somehow less valuable because her father didn't think she was worthy of his wealth, I want to tell her something. I want to tell her that the exclusion will hurt. I want to tell her that there will be years when she questions herself, when she wonders if her father was right, when she feels the weight of being deemed not good enough. But I also want to tell her that she will survive it. More than survive, she will thrive in ways her father couldn't have imagined. She will build a life based on her own values. She will write stories that matter. She will help other people heal from their own family wounds. She will discover that the inheritance she loses is far less valuable than the person she becomes in the process of losing it. And years later, when she finally takes control of her story, when she stops being defined by what was taken from her and starts being defined by what she's chosen to build, she'll realize that this was the real reclamation. Not taking back money. Not proving her worth to people who couldn't see it. But reclaiming her own narrative, her own voice, her own right to define what a successful and meaningful life looks like. The rain continues to fall outside the coffee shop. My coffee has gone cold. And I'm at peace with all of it. The exclusion, the struggle, the eventual discovery of my own resilience. Because I finally understand that my story was never about my father's judgment. It was always about my own power to write the ending.